the odds are really stacked, in the favor of your brain getting addicted to something that's being manipulated from the outside or has been passed down, is heritable. But once we know that, we can start to shift that dynamic by paying attention to how much dopamine we're putting in our brain, how we are interpreting the motivation of drinking, how we're breaking those habits, how we are noticing when our brain feels numb or dull. And so, as always, awareness is the first place to start. So if you're wondering why me, it could be that you too have been in a place where the arm of big alcohol and these other factors has really impacted your brain in a way that feels like it's sort of out of your control. Welcome to the Sober Edge podcast, inspiration for alcohol-free living. I'm your host, Terry Patterson, functional nutritionist and This Naked Mind senior coach. The Sober Edge is a place to explore the infinite possibilities on the other side of drinking. In a culture soaked in booze, discover the wonder and joy of taking a different path. Meet real people living lives of purpose and passion, learn the truth behind the alcohol myths, and get ready to be motivated, inspired, and astounded by what is possible with the Sober Edge. Well, hey everyone, it's Terry back with another edition of the Sober Edge podcast. And I recently completed a certification in the psychology of addiction with Dr. Anna Lempke, yes, the author of Dopamine Nation. And today I want to share some of the insights I learned about why me. Why did I become addicted to alcohol? And you may very well be asking yourself the same question. So let's dive in. First of all, we want to understand that addiction includes risk factors. So we often wonder if there's a genetic risk factor, if it's trauma related, and all of the questions we have about why me. So the answer is really yes and, which is fascinating. So one thing that I found and discovered in this course is the change in the addiction model. So we used to think that addiction was a moral failing. We used to think that addiction was connected to a lot of other things. And currently, if you look at the scientific model, we see that addiction is really part of a disease model. And so that means there is a certain risk factor. And so one of the things I want to talk about is the risk factor of nature, nurture, and neighborhood. Now, this is from the course that Dr. Anna Lempke taught. But I also think it's really valuable and pertinent to all of us because sometimes we think that the reason we are addicted to alcohol or are far down the alcohol use disorder spectrum is because of our genetics. And when I studied with Annie Grace for this Naked Mind Institute coaching certification in 2019, there really was no known factor for a specific gene that we could relate to alcohol use disorder. And that really is still true. However, what we see from studies with identical twins, we see that half of the risk factor can be related to genetics. And these things are heritable, enduring personality traits. Some things such as if someone is a natural risk taker. If somebody is more risk avoidance, they're going to be less likely. The other things that come from genetics is if you have a co-occurring mental illness, even something like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that can increase your genetic predisposition to having alcohol use disorder be more dramatic. In other words, becoming more addicted easier. And I think that's really fascinating because we don't need to place blame anywhere. We get to understand the facts and take 100% responsibility for our own choices. So it is possible that some of your addiction or my addiction came from my genetics. And the second thing we really want to look at is what happened in the household. We want to look at the nurture aspect. And nature versus nurture has long been a conversation around all kinds of influence. And so when it comes to alcohol use disorder, we want to think about what happened that is in our upbringing that might have created a larger propensity or greater propensity to become addicted to alcohol. And so there are things such as early childhood adverse experiences. There's actually an ACE score, ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And I will post that link so that you can take that very simple assessment for yourself. But it's not the only thing, and it's not a one size fits all. So we do see that 1 child in 4 did experience an adverse event that could create a greater tendency toward addiction. And this isn't just alcohol, but all addiction. The course that I took was the psychology of addiction. So it spans more than just alcohol, but really alcohol was a big part of the study because that is one of the most common drugs. So these early childhood experiences can actually affect our epigenetics. And that's where we see that, yes, this can have a longer lasting effect. And then when we look at what Dr. Anna Lempke calls neighborhood, we look at the social and peer aspect of where we live. And it's fascinating because I always hear people, they'll want to say that, well, Americans are the biggest drinkers, or my goodness, you should see the Germans, or the Australians, or the British, or the Canadians. And so the truth is that humans everywhere drink alcohol. And there's a lot of peer pressure based on where we live and a lot of actual just access. And so, what we learned in the course from Dr. David Cartwright, also from Stanford University, is that the more access we have, the more likely we're going to become addicted. In other words, you have to have the ability to try a substance in order to get hooked on that substance. And so tobacco is a good example. And one thing that was interesting in the 1860s, when things really shifted for the tobacco industry, they actually came up with a cigarette rolling machine. So prior to the cigarette rolling machine and that technology, people were able to hand roll cigarettes at the rate of 4 cigarettes per hour. With the invention of the cigarette rolling machine, it was 20,000 cigarettes in 1 hour. So now there was way more access to many more opportunities to try tobacco and get hooked on nicotine. And we also see this with prohibition, another great example. So when prohibition hit in the 1920s, let's see, I have the dates here. Prohibition was 1920 to 1933. So in those 13 years, we actually see that alcohol use disorder plummeted because access was limited. And that decline in alcohol use disorder lasted all the way till the 1960s. So that impact was lasting. It took a long time for more access to become available, for it to become more socially acceptable to drink. And then with more access, we see continuing increasing rates of addiction. So in the 1990s, we see alcohol use disorder increased by 50%. And American women are now at the same risk as American men. And that's something new that's just happened in this century. So it's really fascinating to think about that we're actually living in this age of addiction. So when we think about, well, why is alcohol so addictive, and why is it me and not my neighbor or my best friend or my kid's teacher, they don't seem to have a problem with alcohol. And so we can really look at the genetics, we can look at our childhood experiences and our epigenetics, and we can look at access. And it's just fascinating to also think about the big alcohol industry and how much influence they're having as well. And so, Dr. David Cartwright, who I mentioned, he talks about us living in this age of addiction. And he says there's really two camps. There's the supply camp and the demand camp. And so supply is, again, how much is available? We think of that idea of neighborhood. How much access do we have? And then demand. And sometimes people want to say that, well, demand is just, mental illness if we solve for that, or it's poverty if we solve for that. But actually, he calls it this interesting name. He calls it limbic capitalism. Now, remember, our limbic system is that base brain. It's in the back of our brain. It's that lizard brain. It's that first part of the brain that's developed where we are operating from instinct. And so this limbic capitalism means that it's easy for us to become addicted because it's not the thinking part of our brain. It's not the rational, emotional part of the brain. It has some emotions as well, but it's not that prefrontal cortex. And so that limbic brain is easier to addict. And so along comes capitalism, to Dr. Cartwright's point, and we see that in fact, we've got alcohol and other drug companies, tobacco companies, for example, opioid companies, actually engineering this environment that appeals to our super hedonic threshold. So hedonism is that seeking pleasure at all costs. And so these companies are actually intentionally engineering products and advertising and marketing and access in a way that really lights up our brain and creates a lot of this. And this is by design. And it's not just that they want you to be addicted with your brain and the dopamine pathways, but they also want to grab your attention. And that comes from things like bells and whistles, like smartphones or casinos. And with alcohol, it comes from certain packaging, certain advertising. You're a runner. So they advertise, 5K, 10K races where people have a quote unquote light beer at the end of the race. And so these are intentional. And it's not just creating access, but now the dollars are not just to the consumer. So it's not just from the producer to the consumer, but it's also the advertiser. So now companies are incentivized to create these really hyper hedonistic, super hedonic environments because they're getting paid by advertising dollars. And so, again, this is why we are in this place where it feels like the age of addiction. And this is intentional, right? And so what's really was interesting about both Dr. Anna Lempke's course and the book Dopamine Nation is just how pervasive this is. And I spoke just a little bit about dopamine there and that place where our brain, wants and likes and remembers how to do the thing that really captivated our brain. So again, this can be, the advertising, this can be the taste, smell, sight, all of those things, sound. We've seen with social media that, making the screen attractive, making it light up, making it give us a notification that has a bell is very addictive. And so when we think about that, I want to drink, but I don't like to drink. Why am I still drinking if I no longer like it? We really have to look at that reward pathway. And that is that dopamine process. And so I'm going to talk more about that specific pain pleasure pathway. But today I'll just say that, it's very rewarding. And this reward pathway about the wanting, in order for it to work, it has to create motivation, even if we don't like it. So the wanting, this is a really good example. So the wanting could be related to, I am motivated to get up to go to work. When the alarm goes off, I get up and I go to work. I'm motivated for that. I want to go to work, but I don't really like it. But what I do like is the rewards from getting up and going to work. I like making an income. I like being able to spend money on things that bring me joy, pleasure, comfort. And so we see that alcohol is stimulating that pathway that is both the liking and the wanting. And that's the dopamine pathway. And so it's fascinating to think if you're caught in that dynamic where it feels like I'm drinking more than I want to, or I'm drinking more and enjoying it less. So dopamine can create an imbalance in the brain when we get that extra hit of dopamine from something like an addictive substance, whether it's, our smartphone. If you've ever found yourself scrolling late at night when you're too tired and you should put down the phone and you're no longer really even enjoying yourself, think about that liking, wanting. That's the dopamine we can recognize. Same thing with alcohol. So if you are recognizing that you have some alcohol use disorder and you are feeling like alcohol is having more impact on your life than you want, and you, again, feel like maybe you are drinking more and enjoying it less, think about that nurture nature neighborhood and think about how it's not your fault. Like the odds are really stacked, in the favor of your brain getting addicted to something that's being manipulated from the outside or has been passed down, is heritable. But once we know that, we can start to shift that dynamic by paying attention to how much dopamine we're putting in our brain, how we are interpreting the motivation of drinking, how we're breaking those habits, how we are noticing when our brain feels numb or dull. And so, as always, awareness is the first place to start. So if you're wondering why me, it could be that you too have been in a place where the arm of big alcohol and these other factors has really impacted your brain in a way that feels like it's sort of out of your control. But the really cool thing is we as humans have neuroplasticity, so we can actually change that pathway. And with less dopamine, we're going to have less of that sensation of the hyper wanting, liking, motivation, reward. We've got to get out of that loop of that reward pathway. We've got to rebalance our brain. And if you're smoking or drinking alcohol, the first thing to do is to stop for an extended period of time to help reset that brain. So I'm going to talk more in a future episode about the pain-pleasure pathway, but I hope this helped to answer a question, why me? Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week on the Sober Edge podcast. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Sober Edge podcast. This is a place for important conversations and a safe place to question everything you thought you knew about drinking. If you're looking for your sober edge, I want to invite you to connect with me at thesobernutritionist.com, where you can grab my free resource, Becoming More, a guide to loving your sober life. And I would be so grateful if you enjoyed this podcast, if you would leave a rating and review, as it will help more people find their sober edge.